All right, welcome back to our third and possibly, hopefully, final video for talking about the Middle Ages in general. We've met our friend Charlemagne. Now let's move on and look at sort of things in the Middle Ages more generally. Now this is a long time period, so things do change over time. You might have this impression of the Middle Ages is never changing, but as we see with like the rise and fall of Charlemagne's empire, things do change. But there are some commonalities that led to a lot of continuity. Things didn't necessarily change very fast, in part because there weren't these huge connections like the Romans had had. That's part of why things stayed kind of constant. The other big thing was you had the church being probably the most powerful unifying organization. And the church kind of wanted things, in Western Europe, that's more the Roman Catholic Church, kind of wanted things to stay the same and people to continue the same religion and religious traditions. And that was one of the forces kind of keeping things going the way they were. Another one of them was what's called feudalism. Now, a lot of historians kind of avoid the concept of feudalism a little bit, and I'll explain that in a second. But I think it's a useful thing to know. So let's start from the absolute basics here. Basically, in the feudal system of medieval Europe, which was popular in places like Germany and Britain and France, and later on places like Spain, even Italy, basically there are three tiers to society. And the way to think about this is probably as kings, noble knights, so knights who are also aristocrats, and peasants, or serfs, if you want to call them that. We might think of knights as being sort of a more humble profession, but that's only because they answer to a king. Knights are usually pretty well off in the Middle Ages. They are more than middle class, probably upper middle class or lower upper class, if you want. They are the next rung down from the king. And then at the bottom, the vast majority of society is the serfs and the peasants, the workers. So here's the way it works. Each of these different groups has something that they can do for each other. So the kings started all off by providing things of land to their vassals, who are noble knights. So these are people who are kind of well off, kind of in the aristocracy, but they are also have the responsibility to be knights. So the king gives the knight a bunch of land, and then the knight has to be a knight for the king. So he has to provide military service to the king. If the king says, we're going to war, the knight says, who with, and joins on up. And this relationship between kings and their knights is known as fealty, which is something that is very much one of the ideals of this time period. There's a lot of famous stories of Charlemagne's knights, and Charlemagne, he gets to be the celebrated figure. So here in one of the sort of great works of literature of this time period is his knight Roland being depicted as swearing his fealty to Charlemagne. So we have these relationships of fealty, of loyalty, and it all has to do with these fiefs of land. So the king gives the land to the knight so he can have a bunch of land, and the knight fights for the king. Then on the next tier down, what does the knight do with that land? Basically, he hires serfs or peasants to work on that land. They are the ones who actually grow the crops. And in fact, he probably will divide up the land into lots and lots of different pieces. Sometimes it'll be like you have a little bit of land over here, and then you just have to give me some of your food. You have to give me some of your food. So other times it may be that the knight and the serf are living on the same land. But in either case, the knight is still getting a bunch of food from the peasant. So this is a situation where the peasant has to work extra hard because not only do they have to feed themselves, they have to feed the rich people. And so the serfs work the noble's land, land which is sometimes called manors. You might think this would be a pretty bad deal for the peasants. In a lot of ways it is. But one way that it provides a good deal is that the knights are supposed to protect the peasants. So if another knight comes in with his army, he is going to defend these peasants from having their crops burned down by this other knight. So there is a reason for the peasants to be loyal to the knights. And so when you think of an army, you should think of these peasants having spears or swords, and only a few people being knights, who are kind of the leaders of a bunch of peasants. And then at the very top are the kings, who have a bunch of knights that answer to them. So a whole king's army would involve a good handful of knights and a lot of peasants. Or you might just have knights going against knights. There's a debate as to whether this system evolved from the way things were set up in Roman times. We don't need to get into all that, but there's arguments for both directions. One thing, we don't see slavery in the same way that we saw it in ancient Rome, which is interesting. That said, the peasants themselves don't have a whole lot of freedom on their own. So there's a lot of questions around this. And I said that historians don't like to use the term feudal very much. This is what's known as feudalism. Instead, they tend to focus on these two different relationships separately. The relationships between being a loyal knight versus the relationship between like working for a noble on their land. But I think you can see how these sometimes form like a three-tier system in most cases. So you can get into more detail and more of the nuances of that, but that's the basics. So you can think about what life was like in this time period. And remember, most people are not knights and definitely not kings. Most people are peasants. So most people are going to be digging in the dirt. So moving on from there, I want to talk about medieval architecture. So there's two styles of medieval architecture, and you should be able to see visually the differences between them. The one that lasts for most of the Middle Ages is what's known as Romanesque architecture. And you can see that it picks up a lot of things from the Romans. It picks up these vaults overhead, giving the building strength. The cathedrals are kind of similar. You know, they have their own styles, but they pick up a lot from basilicas, buildings like the Hagia Sophia and whatnot. And usually we see this architecture in cathedrals. These buildings for God are where people devote most of their money and their time. It may take generations to build them, but by God and for God, they build them. So these buildings, they have this sort of style of smooth stone and generally using Roman techniques. But at near the end of the Middle Ages, something comes along that's very different. But I do have a couple more pictures of Romanesque architecture. You can see these sort of smooth stone. This one actually is a modern version of the same thing. This is actually on the campus where I went to school, which is pretty fun. But the other style is Gothic architecture, and that's from the 1200s into the 1600s. And it probably evolved out of the other style, but you can kind of notice the difference here. It's very, very spiky. You see all these sort of little details and these spikes bristling off of it, and just this more deeper carving and whatnot. And so to people who really liked the old style, they said that this style looked like it was made by a bunch of Goths, that is, barbarians from Germany. Even though this was Germany at this time period, they still kind of remembered the Goths. All this detail and all this spikiness, it looked barbaric to them. But eventually people started to just call the buildings Gothic. And then when people started hanging out in cathedrals and writing sort of dark romantic poetry, they called that Gothic. And then when people read a lot of that poetry, they called themselves Goths. And so that's how we get the black makeup wearing Goths from the barbarian Goths. It takes a few centuries, but we get there. Other features of Gothic architecture, lots of stained glass, more realism in their historical sculptures. This is not a time period where realism is very popular in art, at least not in the way it was for the Greeks and Romans. But they get more realistic, they get more historical. And there's also a thing called flying buttresses. So what are flying buttresses? Well, we'll see in a second. Just a few more pictures of one of these cathedrals. This is Chartres Cathedral. And if you look right over there, we zoom in, on one of these buildings. Oh, and we can see it even more here. We have these weird arches on the outside. Here's Notre Dame Cathedral, which tragically needs some repairs right now, but fortunately a lot of it is still intact. It is also famous for these arches on the outside, and these are the flying buttresses. So to buttress something is to hold it up, kind of like if you put your hand up against the wall, you could like, or you put your hand up against someone who's falling over, maybe that's a better image, you hold it up for. And that's exactly what these arches on the outside do. They're flying because they're flying away on the outside, and they're buttresses because they're holding things up, even though that's such a funny way to say it, buttresses. But yeah, this is a building technique that allows them to build even bigger and bigger cathedrals, bigger and more impressive buildings. Continuing on from our theme of medieval video games, which you may notice I have an interest in, one of the great examples of video games of Gothic architecture is in the game Dark Souls, where you see these incredibly Gothic cathedrals, some of them built in a way that's kind of impossible, larger than life. You have buttresses upon buttresses upon buttresses, and the whole thing is enormous and preposterously huge. It's great. This one is a little easier to see the like level of detail and spikiness that leads to all this Gothicness. But the way that they've built this is a sort of Gothic architect's fantasy come to life, which is pretty great. Talking about the stained glass windows, they are pretty darn gorgeous. One of the most famous is Chartres Cathedral, which I mentioned before, has these beautiful patterns of glass, which is a technology that is basically invented during this time period, making patterns with these different colors of glass to make pictures in the glass. And if you think about it, in this time period, most people don't read, and they don't really know the Bible super well because the Bible is in Latin. So the priests know Latin, but they don't know Latin usually. So how are they going to get their sense of the Bible? How are they going to get their Bible stories? A lot of the time, it's from these images. And that's what these images show, is they show these stories from the Bible so people can learn them and know them. Here's, actually, we're going to get a zoom in here. We've got Mother Mary with baby Jesus. We've got the four gospel writers around here, I think, although there's actually more, it might just be different archangels. But there's so many details. Did not mean to do that in one of these images. And you can see how this would have sort of given people a sense of God that was filled with energy and life during this time period. And like I said, the sculptures are really, really cool and impressive. And one that's fun is that, like, hey, look, here near the end of the Middle Ages, we're starting to get more into bringing back Greek and Roman stuff. So here's Pythagoras from Greek history, studying mathematics. And so you can see that we're bringing back some more of the Greek art style too. So, it's not a super clear division between this is modern times and this is the Middle Ages. Things happen more gradually than that. Okay, so that's mainly what I want to show for medieval art. Now I want to talk about the Vikings. So the Vikings are pretty cool. They're also known as the Norse, or the Nords, the Northmen of Europe. They come from Scandinavia, so the area of Finland and Sweden and places like that. And what they were doing in this time period is they were pretty disconnected from Christianity that was overtaking the world, or the Western Europe. And they had some things in common with the culture of Western Europe, but they didn't become Christian until much later on. So their mythology is more known to us than the German mythology, which was, we think, pretty closely related. But they were an influence on Russia. They were an influence on Britain in some ways. And what they would do is they were raiders. They were pirates or, invaders. What they would do is they would go to monasteries and they would steal all of their golden goblets and things like that. And that's what Vikings means originally, as raiders. But we have an image of Vikings as these sort of wild, monstrous people, these barbarians. In fact, they weren't necessarily, their culture wasn't just cruel and evil. but people experience them that way because a lot of the early accounts we have are by the monks who got raided by them. But in some ways, the Norse or the Vikings could be pretty nice. They had a lot of respect for women. There were women warriors among them, which is pretty cool. Women often held a place of honor. Women had the right to make some decisions in that society and to own their own property and things like that. So the Norse, might be a good place in ancient times to be a woman. Sorry, mumbled there. Also, on top of that, we have this image of Viking as being this symbol of, white people and racist people and things like that. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Norse were pretty well connected because they were sailing all around the world as far as they could go. They traded with the Muslim world and seemed to get along really well with the Muslim cultures. And in general, they just seem to have had a lot of really sort of open-minded and egalitarian ideas. Now, at the same time, they were raiding people for gold, so let's not forget that. But there were a lot of things that were pretty cool about them. And of course, you may have heard that Leif Erikson, a Viking, reached America long before Columbus did. And that is true. Vikings or Norse people did travel to the Americas. They just didn't stay there. They lived there for a little while, but eventually abandoned their settlements and went home. But there is evidence of them doing that. So as far as we know, they are the first to have traveled all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And of course, all this was made possible by Viking ships being really good. They had these ships which they called longboats, which were just very effective for getting around in a hurry. So they had some good naval technology underlying them. Now, you may have the image of Vikings as wearing horned helmets. This is, in fact, not true. Vikings did not wear horned helmets. Here, over on the right, is what a Viking helmet looked like. It's pretty cool. It's pretty striking. But yeah, no horns on here. And so where does this image of Vikings as having horned helmets come from? Well, honestly, you kind of have to blame Bugs Bunny. And before that, blame a guy called Wagner. So Wagner, if you haven't heard about him, he wrote these gigantic, really long operas called the Ring Cycle, which was based on German mythology and Norse mythology. And in his play, the costume design, in his opera, the costume design involved these horned helmets for the warriors. That became such a famous image that it became part of pop culture. And then Bugs Bunny, in his opera, cartoon about the same opera, he basically showed the same thing. Well, Bugs Bunny's not a real person, but you get what I mean. So because he was pairing Wagner and everybody loves Bugs Bunny, that continued on to us. So Bugs Bunny and Wagner gave us the idea of horned helmets. But actually, there's a really good reason why the historical Vikings would not have had horned helmets. And maybe you can guess why. It's because if you have horns on your helmet and you're in the middle of a heavy battle, and the Vikings did get into a lot of heavy battles, someone's going to grab onto the horns of your helmet and yank you to the ground. It's a very big design flaw for a warrior. As cool as it looks, it's just not going to work. So it wasn't really popular with them. So Vikings, a little bit different than how we think of them, but they were pretty important in history, and they were pretty terrifying to the people who they raided. Looking at the map here, here's about where they traveled. So they're coming out of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, places like that, and they're going all around here. They become an influence on Russia. They even managed to become an influence on Britain as well. They're, in some ways, England and the UK are descended from a mix of French and Vikings and the people who are already there. So there's quite a lot going on with the Vikings. And the time periods when they're active, we can think of the 700s to the 1000s. But eventually they kind of settle down and calm down and stop going around and raiding. But they do also settle Iceland and Greenland. So they're pretty significant in spreading their particular culture around the world. So they're a big part of this Middle Ages experience as well. The last thing I want to talk about is the crisis of the church and how that led to the Crusades. So the Crusades, again, we're kind of moving into the end of the medieval time period when we talk about the Crusades. But let's talk about them. So it seems like in the 1100s and the 1200s, things got weird with the church. People started getting a little impatient with the church or feeling like it was doing a bad job, kind of dissatisfied with the leadership of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, they weren't really able to overthrow this leadership or break away from it like the Protestants would do later on. But there was a lot of tension as to whether something like that might happen. And some of the things that were problems were, for instance, the popes were acting more like really powerful kings of Rome than they were acting like spiritual leaders. Some of them had mistresses and things like that. So there was a fear that the church had become corrupted by the world and had lost sight of its religious, spiritual goals. So there were a lot of responses to that. One of them was a new religious movements like St. Francis. St. Francis, as illustrated in this excellent cartoon, was a guy who really lived out in nature and sort of communed with the birds, the trees, and believed in living a really holy, humble, simple life that was very peaceful and not very greedy. And he inspired a lot of other people to follow him. And the church said, okay, yeah, we'll make that an official movement that people can join. Maybe as kind of a release valve. If you're feeling like you're fed up with the way things are going, why don't you just join this movement? But to be fair to St. Francis, it seems like it was a pretty cool movement. That was one kind of response, and there were other movements as well, like Dominicans and other new groups, Jesuits coming along during this time period. And one of the responses of the church that was not so fun was the Inquisition. So this was mainly happening in Spain, but in other places as well, a crackdown on heretics and Jews and Muslims. So this was a time period where things got bad for Jews and Muslims in Europe. And there was also a lot of new learning. We think this is a time when the population was rising and knowledge was expanding. And there were new philosophers that came along. But this also led to the Crusades. Talking about the philosophers, probably the most important philosopher is Thomas Aquinas. The thing to know about him is he basically picked up where St. Augustine left off. If there's two philosophers for Catholicism, one of them is St. Augustine and the other is St. Aquinas. And St. Aquinas was influenced by the growing knowledge of Greek and Roman philosophy that was coming in. And he had the real goal of unifying logic and science with religion. Because up until this time period, there was a lot of this is just what God says, don't question it. Whereas Aquinas really believed that knowledge and what we would call scientific investigation of the world could be reconciled. So he invented the concept of intelligent design, which is not thought of as the more sciencey option today, but was in this time period thought of as a way of saying, hey, look, we noticed there are all these creatures in the world and we studied them and examined them. Here's a way we can connect that to God. So he had a lot of ideas like that. He tried to do things like prove God's existence through logic. So he's pretty significant in the founding of the church, and a lot of Catholic philosophy today is pretty much his ideas. So he's a name to know in terms of the development of religion and philosophy. But the note I want to end on here is talking about the Crusades. So the Crusades, what were they? Well, they were another response to this crisis that the church was going through during this time. Basically, the Pope, specifically, it started with a guy named Pope Urban. Pope Urban said, hey, have we noticed that the Holy Land, that is Jerusalem and Bethlehem, all the areas where Jesus and Judaism took place, that is currently under control of the Caliphate, of the Muslims. And so Urban said, why don't we get all the Christians from Europe to work together to fight the Muslims and take back Jerusalem, basically. And so this was a very clever idea. It unified Christians under having the same goal, to take back the Holy Land, and it kind of took the heat off the church itself when people were worried about it. And part of this, the way it worked was that there were a lot of young men who didn't have a whole lot of land, because in this time period, a lot of the land was going to just the firstborn son. So the secondborn sons were left without really anything to do. So they wanted money, they wanted power. So Pope Urban offered them God, gold, and glory. They would go to heaven. They would have lots of glory, and maybe most importantly to them, they would come back with lots of loot, or they would be able to take some piece of Jerusalem for themselves and settle down there. So that was the idea. And it seemed like such a noble thing. And even today, I think sometimes people get this idea of the Crusades as a noble thing. But if you really look at what's recorded historically, it seems like they were a really bad idea. It was a campaign that did not go super well and was kind of a mess, mainly because the young men who were in those armies were greedy as heck, or greedy as hell, I suppose we could say. In the First Crusade, the idea was that they would go and they would join up with the Byzantine emperor, and they would all work together to take back the Holy Land. But along the way, these young men, they just couldn't help themselves. They just started burning and plundering random small towns along the way, which understandably made the Byzantine emperor less than happy. So it seems like they weren't really as motivated by God as they were motivated by loot. And it continued on in this vein for some time. The Fourth Crusade was probably the most ridiculous of all. They went on their way to Holy Land, and then they decided, that's kind of too far away. So instead of ransacking the Holy Land, they just decided to ransack Constantinople instead. So the Venetians, particularly under their leaders, decided to just ransack Constantinople. And this was the time period where Constantinople and Greece was taken over by Venice. So that's how that happened. And it's pretty wild that they just didn't end up caring about their original mission to take over the Holy Land. The Children's Crusade, not so good either. It was like the same thing, only a bunch of children were coming with, because, you know, it's inspiring to have children be part of religion, except that a lot of them got killed or sold into slavery. It's hard to say exactly how that went down, but it doesn't seem like it went well. And so these young men who really just wanted stuff, they caused a lot of problems along the way. Now, in some ways it did work. For various time periods, leaders in Europe did control parts of Jerusalem. They, settled, and there were new settlements there, and there was some intermarriage between Christians and Jews, Christians and Muslims, which is kind of interesting too. So as much as the Crusades were ultimately kind of a bad idea, there were a lot of effects that came out of them. One of them was that there was more contact between the Christian world and the Muslim world than there had been before. And this led to more Greek and Roman knowledge being brought over to Europe and sort of leading us more in the direction of the modern world. Muslim stories of romance became popular and led to Christian ideas of romance as well. It seems like the Muslim romance story was an influence on knights and their noble ladies telling stories of romance as well. And even though the control by Christians of this part of the world, of Jerusalem, didn't last long, the stories remained important. And this tension between Christians and Muslims, seeing these two cultures as inherently opposed, well, that's never really been true and wasn't really true during this time period. This was a time period when people sort of wanted to promote that idea and make it true. So this legacy, this idea of Christians fighting Muslims for control, and these two different cultures, these two different worlds, in some ways, I think we're still fighting the Crusades, seeing the Christian European world versus the Muslim, quote, Middle Eastern world as inherently opposed and as a clash of cultures, when really up until the Crusades, they were getting along just fine. So I think that's kind of the historical legacy too. And again, defining this idea of Europe as this part of the world being defined by its religion, by Christianity or Christendom. So for the Christian world versus the Muslim world, this might be the time period where that idea gets invented. So this isn't true for the whole Middle Ages. A lot of this is being invented near the end here in the 1200s. So there's a lot we have to take into account here, but there's also a lot to think about. So That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in terms of the Middle Ages. So there's a lot going on, but hopefully I've managed to hit the high points. There's a lot of detail you can go into with all these histories, but hopefully this gives a sense of sort of the pros and cons of being in this time period, the different connections versus tensions, the way things worked during this time period. And what I'm going to leave you guys with is your take on things. And what do you think, based on all this evidence, was the Middle Ages in Europe a good time to live, or was it not? What do you guys think? I'll be very curious to hear your answers to that question. And then I will see you guys after the break. So don't forget about your papers. And if you have any questions, I'm always available by email. I'll keep checking back every day. So yeah, just let me know. And yeah, take care, and I will see you after the break.